And joining me now is host of The Beat with Ari Melber on MS Now, Ari Melber, and MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, Yale Law School professor and president of the Budget Lab at Yale, Natasha Sarin, and New York Times chief White House correspondent and MS Now political analyst Peter Baker. Ari, I'm going to start with you. So at first this morning, I think some people thought the chaos was over now because of this decision from the Supreme Court. But after listening to the president speak, I think it's very clear we're actually still in chaos. How much of a crisis would you say we are in at the moment?
Well, for people affected by this ruling, there's a lot of questions from what the president just said. And so it was a crisis to many that they were in this uncertainty and that the costs were being put on the American people. That's the why of how all this matters. And then you say, what actually happened? We heard from a president who lost today, big, and sounds like he knows he lost and is in attack mode because he lost. I think the ruling gives us a lot more of a roadmap, which is true both in the courts who have to interpret anything the White House tries next, but also for the wider business community, consumers, everyone out there has this very clear roadmap, 6-3 on the limits on the president's powers to try to seize tariffs from Congress. One thing we did not hear, and Lisa and I were doing live coverage, and we hadn't mentioned this yet. One thing we hadn't hear at all from the president was, let me go down to Congress and work on something together. They have the tariff power. That's what it says in both the Constitution and the ruling. And we didn't hear that. And that, again, speaks to the president's style. He says, make America great again, but he doesn't want to do it within the great American system that the court just reinforced, which is we don't have a king, we don't have a dictator. Congress has these powers. He could do the trade agenda he has with Congress. He didn't talk about that. Instead, he talked about other roads and loopholes, and the court has a clear limit on how those roads will work. He's welcome to try other things, but the headline here is less of a crisis in the sense that a lot of these tariffs are going to be reined in.
So, Lisa, as Ari just spelled out there, the president very clearly upset, kind of in the posture of someone who knows that they have lost in that speech. But we also heard him say that two of the very justices that he put onto that Supreme Court are embarrassments to their families. When you hear the president lash out in that way, while also claiming that he has his plan for how he's going to keep much of this tariff structure in place anyway, what do you make of it?
I think it's destabilizing to American trust in the Supreme Court at a time where most Americans do not have trust in the Supreme Court. When you look at public polling, Antonia, you can see how that trust has eroded over time from Americans who already believe that this court is sort of instrumentalist and partisan. Today doesn't do much to help that at a time where we are about to go into a midterm elections, where we already see warning signs that the president is not prepared to accept results, where he is trying to eviscerate the ability of Americans to vote via mail-in ballot, where he is using his FBI and Department of Justice to seize ballots that were kept by Fulton County in an effort to relitigate the 2020 election results there. So I thought it was extraordinarily dangerous rhetoric. As for whether or not these justices are an embarrassment to their families, much less a disgrace to the nation, I thought that one of the justices here, Justice Gorsuch, really is if anything, not a disgrace to the nation, but a reminder of our separation of powers in the constitutional system that he is obligated to uphold in place. In his concurrence, he has this sort of overture, I don't know what else to call it, to the legislative process, sort of reminding people why the legislative process matters, both as an underpinning of our system, but also why, if people believe that these tariffs are the wisest policy result, that the way to do it, as Ari has said, is to go to Congress and ask them to specifically enumerate a way for the president to actually impose tariffs himself. It's not that Congress is without that power. They could delegate some of this authority to the president. What the court is finding today is that the words regulate importation, whatever they mean, they do not include the power of taxation. That is literally in a sentence what the court is deciding today. And Justice Gorsuch is basically saying, look, you might think that legislation is slow and too deliberative, but that is the bulwark of liberty for our system. Trust in the legislative process. That's as much a reminder to the polity as it is to President Trump himself.
Peter Baker, so why didn't the president, at the beginning of his term, go to Congress? He controls basically all of government right now. He could have worked with his allies in the House and in the Senate to get this done. Why didn't he do that route?
Well, a couple things, right? He does control Congress in the sense that Republicans have majorities in both the House and Senate, but they don't have big majorities, right? We've seen how dysfunctional the House is with just a handful of seats, and the Senate, of course, anything that would require a 60-vote filibuster-proof majority, is something beyond the reach of the president, it looks like these days. So the truth is he came into this term determined not to use Congress, not just on tariffs, but on almost everything. We've never seen a president that I can remember in our lifetime who came in after an election and didn't use his first year in office or back in office to try to achieve something big legislatively. This president basically hasn't done that. He had one big spending bill. And that's about it. Everything else has been done through executive power. He doesn't like the congressional process. He doesn't want to have to compromise. He doesn't want to have to deal with Democrats, certainly, but even fellow Republicans who might, have some say on whatever he wanted to get done. And he likes the idea of being able to simply do things on his own, to be able to snap his fingers. And nothing for him has been more satisfying in that way than the tariff power. He loves to be able to snap his fingers and say, okay, I'm mad at you. I'm going to put a tariff on you. Why did he put tariffs on Canada most recently? Because he was mad at a video that somebody in Canada, Premier of Ontario, had put online reminding us that Ronald Reagan didn't like tariffs. And he didn't like this president of Switzerland who got on the phone with him. So tariff, it's a kingly-like power that appeals to his sense of authoritarian power and unquestioned ability. Now, the Supreme Court has said you're not an authoritarian. You don't get to do that.
So, Natasha, we heard the president say they're effective immediately. These national security tariffs are going to stay in place. 10% global tariff. Can you help me break down what that means? What is the literal state of play right now in this country, Natasha?
Well, my colleagues and I at Yale Budget Lab are hard at work producing exactly those type of estimates, Antonia. And so basically where we started before this morning's decision is we had about $3 trillion of tariffs over the course of a decade in place. About 2/3 of them were at play in this case because they were effectuated with this IEEPA authority. What happened as a result of the Supreme Court decision is those 2/3 of tariffs went away very temporarily, because now what the president has done, and kind of what was broadly anticipated that he would do, is essentially try and replicate the existing tariffs that were at the highest level that we've seen in the last century through these other authorities. The challenge is the other authorities that he's deploying, they have more process restrictions. So, for example, to do this 10% across the board tariff, it only can be in place for 150 days before, in theory, they have to go to Congress to try to keep those in place at those levels. And so it's not really clear what the end game is likely to be here. But the reality is that if we get tariffs at levels that we had as a result of IEEPA through these other authorities, that's going to be tariff rates in the range of 20% across effective tariff rates, and about $2,000 of price increases for the average American consumer as a result of those tariffs. And also not clear based on this decision this morning, and you started to say it as you were describing in your open, Antonia, is we have about $200 billion of tariffs, about $150 billion of them that were at play in IEEPA that have already been paid in. What happens with respect to those refunds, potential refunds, is a question that the decision is fully silent on and has a whole host of consequences for importers, but also for American consumers.
Ari, why do you think the Supreme Court didn't give us the roadmap for how people are going to be paid back, what the mechanism, the function is for that? Why were they quiet on it?
Not everyone likes to do all their homework. Is part of it. Second is, in these types of cases, I mean, the court will often say, these are the lines, we don't want to get hypotheticals, you guys figure it out. In the biggest loss that Trump had last year, which was much simpler, you had a detainee, Garcia, who was apparently wrongly deported. And they said, we must facilitate his return. And initially people were concerned, well, is this a hard rule, and why isn't there a deadline, and this and that? But ultimately, the law held. I understand why there's so much concern with how often Trump and Pam Bondi are trying to break the law. I mean, that's been documented. But sometimes the court understands that a general guideline with an intention will work better than trying to sit with 9 justices in robes and actually do all the homework and do it. And in this case, it's even more complex. It involves foreign policy. It involves a lot of other things. I will mention a subsidiary point, which is they let the tariffs stand, which was kind of a nice gesture to Donald Trump, even though he was on his way to a loss. He lost in the lower courts. So these things operate for that long as a way of giving him what we might call, and I'm simplifying, benefit of the doubt. In the end, he still lost. Now they say no. The question you ask is important and insightful, because there are many people who would say they were too nice to begin with. Because of the reasons you just mentioned, they should have paused this up front because it was likely to lose. It had lost in the lower courts. And so this is an area where, on the one hand, we are in different times. When the president is calling the names we heard today, when he's asking for opponents and journalists to be indicted in cases that continuously come up short, we're in different times. The court sometimes, though, is still operating like old times and saying, you get the benefit of the doubt. Critics would say that let him run roughshod now for 13 months or so. I guess a little less. He's been in for 13 months. 10 months. Experts. 10 months running roughshod with tariffs because he benefited from the time. But that's the short answer to sum up everything I'm just saying. They were being nice. They were being conservative. But ultimately, they said, no, you don't have that power.
A seismic ruling today from the United States Supreme Court of monumental consequence. One that not only forcibly upends a core pillar of Donald Trump's economic policy, but also, in rare form for this court of late, limits the scope of Donald Trump's presidential power. Writing for the 6-3 majority, Chief Justice John Roberts explains why Trump does not have the tariff authority he's asserted these past several months. Quote, the president asserts the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In light of the breadth, history, and constitutional context of that asserted authority, he must identify clear congressional authorization to exercise it. Basically, if Congress doesn't pass a law saying he can do it, he can't do it. In response, Donald Trump, live and on camera, seemed to go about the 7 stages of grief in front of an assembled press and obviously the world. First, shock, denial, anger, rage, really, at the Supreme Court. It took the form of a disgusting new line of attack on the 6 justices who ruled against him. Watch.
They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. They're an automatic no matter how good a case you have. It's a no. But you can't knock their loyalty. It's one thing you can do with some of our people. Others think they're being politically correct, which has happened before far too often with certain members of this court, and it's happened so often with this court. What a shame. Having to do with voting in particular, when in fact they're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats, and not that this should have anything at all to do with it. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution.
For those keeping score at home, that was a new low even for him. Trump's 7 stages of grief, processed from there, bargaining, depression, I dare say, testing, and ultimately acceptance, as he announced that he'd attempt to invoke a new 10% global tariff, citing an act passed in 1974, although, once again, there are questions about his legal authority to do it that way. Despite Donald Trump's assertion today that this was some sort of twisted victory for the administration, it's actually a win for those who have argued that he'd overstepped his authorities and for advocates of our 250-year-old separation of powers tradition. This was our 3rd branch of government ordering the 2nd to seek approval from the 1st. The short, medium, and long-term consequences of this development are still taking shape, even as we come on the air. It is more uncertainty for American businesses, large and small. They have already paid a price, literally and figuratively. So what about refunds for those businesses and their customers? How will the administration put the toothpaste back in the tube? In his dissent, conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh writes this, quote, the court says nothing today about whether, and if so, how, the government should go about returning the billions of dollars that it has collected from importers. But that process is likely to be a mess, as was acknowledged at oral argument. On that point, the New York Times writes this, quote, so far the U.S. Treasury has collected roughly $240 billion in tariff revenue since April 2nd, 2025, a date Trump labeled Liberation Day as he imposed his sweeping tariffs. The research firm Capital Economics estimates that if the Treasury is forced to issue refunds, the cost would run to about $120 billion, or 0.5% of GDP. The blast radius of this landmark decision extends outward from there. What about the stock market? Trump insisted our economy would suffer if the court struck down tariffs, but look at that. At close a few moments ago, things held steady. The Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ ended the day up slightly. What about Trump's trade deals? Struck under penalty of a mechanism over which he has no control anymore. But for the moment, the White House must scheme its way forward, following an increasingly rare directive from the Supreme Court. It told Donald Trump no. That's where we start today with Neil Katyal. He argued against the tariffs before the United States Supreme Court, representing a group of more than 50 businesses. He's also the former principal deputy solicitor general of the United States. He's also a former close friend of our show. We're happy to see you, Neil. Congratulations on your win today.
Thank you. Wonderful to see you, Nicole.
So take me inside what the court decided, and then we'll deal with what happens next.
Yeah, so the court, I think, today really strongly said President Trump's tariffs policy is unconstitutional and illegal. They said, look, if you want to get tariffs, the way to do it is to go to Congress and ask for authorization. And so, you know, it's not a decision about any particular president. It's a decision about the presidency. And the Chief Justice, writing for 6 justices, used very strong language about the president, saying, you know, the Constitution requires you to get this affirmative approval of the Congress, and you can't just do this on your own. In America, the stroke of the president's pen is not enough to impose taxes on the American people, and tariffs are nothing else but taxes, the Chief Justice said. And I think it's notable that this decision wasn't just written by some group of lefty justices, to the extent there even are any. It was written by and joined by 6 justices, including 2 justices appointed by Donald Trump himself, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett. Both of them saying in full that these tariffs were unconstitutional. And so, you know, when I presented the argument to the Supreme Court on November 5th, I made about 6 key points. Every single one, Nicole, of those 6 points was accepted 100% by all 6 justices today on the Supreme Court.
So explain the dissent to me.
Yeah, so the dissent written by Justice Kavanaugh says that presidents have flexibility, and if the president is able to, for example, blockade goods, then he should be able to impose taxes on goods. And the fundamental problem with that, as the Chief Justice said, echoing what I said at the argument, is tariffs are fundamentally different than blockades. Blockades stop some goods from coming in, but they don't impose taxes on the American people. They don't take money out of your wallet in order for you to get something. So that's very different than a blockade. And that's why, you know, going all the way back to the Boston Tea Party, and this is something that the Chief Justice again recognized in his opinion for the court, we've always understood the taxation power to be special and different. And so I think the court today sends a clear message to the president, to future presidents, hey, you got to color within the lines. And Nicole, you know, I've had the privilege of being the government's top lawyer, the federal government's top lawyer in the Supreme Court. It's frankly, you know, a big deal whenever any federal policy is challenged, but it's incredibly rare to have one of the president's signature initiatives challenged and go to the Supreme Court, and rarer still to have the Supreme Court say no. You know, normally presidents get all sorts of deference, and I think here the president got deference, but the policy that he chose was so blatantly unconstitutional and illegal that the Supreme Court said no.
6 members of the Supreme Court said no. 3 seem to give him a tunnel. You
only need 5 in this business.
To burrow under.
You only need 5 in this business.
Well, I want to turn to his reaction. I think, were on the air together through the duration of his really unprecedented smears against Robert Mueller and the people who investigated him. He seemed to use that category of smears for the 6 Supreme Court justices who delivered this ruling. Really, you know, I'm not a lawyer, never argued before the Supreme Court, but they seem to say this is illegal and unconstitutional. And in response, Donald Trump says your family should be embarrassed of you. You are a disgrace, to Amy Coney Barrett, to Chief Justice Roberts, to Justice Gorsuch, and to the 3 liberal justices. Have you heard that before in your career?
Look, I'm not going to, Nicole, respond to the president's comments. I mean, I'm focused on what the decision said, which is a Well, it's a resounding win for the American people and for the Constitution. I mean, I can tell you that I've been on the losing end of Supreme Court decisions, both as the government's top lawyer and in private practice or representing pro bono clients. I have deep respect for the court and always do, whether I win or lose. One of the great things about the American system is what just happened today. I mean, just think about it. I was able to go to court, the son of immigrants, able to go to court and say on behalf of American small businesses, hey, this president is acting illegally. And I was able to present my case, have them ask really hard questions at me. It was a really intense oral argument. And at the end of it, they voted and we won. That is something so extraordinary about this country, the idea that we have a system that self-corrects, that allows us to say, you might be the most powerful man in the world, but you still can't break the Constitution. I mean, that to me is what today is about.
What do you make of the fact that the ruling in spirit and resoundingness, as you said, you only need 5, 6 justices delivered this ruling today, this decision. Again, to the non-expert public, 3 of them were appointed by Democratic presidents, 3 of them were appointed by Republican presidents, 2, as you said, by Donald Trump. And his response was to figure out a workaround. Do those same small businesses feel like the storm has passed, or are they still concerned about Donald Trump and tariffs?
Well, I think you always have to be concerned when you have a president who, signals some disrespect for the law and the judicial system. So, I suspect that, that some of our clients are still concerned. The decision today, like any court decision, isn't going to put every concern to rest. But I think it's a really clear statement by the Supreme Court that the president's got to color within the lines and can't just adopt extravagant tariff policies without going to Congress first. And I think that's a really important point here, which is we weren't saying you can never have tariffs. We were saying that the American way is to go and get them approved by the Congress. And if the president is so right that we need these tariffs, that we are suckers and all the other language he used, if that's right today, he has a very clear path. Indeed, I believe he's going there on Tuesday to the State of the Union. He could ask for Congress to impose such legislation. He's been able to do that for more than a year, and he hasn't. Now, notably, when he was president the first time, he did try and get legislation passed by Congress, and they said no. And I think that tells you all you need to know about where this tariff policy is headed.
Big news to end the week, a major loss for Trump at the Supreme Court, striking down his tariffs as illegal. The court found Trump did not have the power to do what he wanted alone. Now, over a year into Trump's second term, he's back at square one on his trade war. Now, how did Trump try to claim these powers in the first place? The answer matters for the rest of his second term because he argued the U.S. faced big emergencies. So he had to claim emergency powers. It's the same kind of fact-free, often extreme power grabs he has deployed, used to put soldiers and agents around the U.S. Some of those folks have been out doing things. Some have been kicked out under court orders. But these can be autocratic, king-like claims where rulers make emergency claims so they can try to see if they can have more power. And if they get away with it, you'll see that kind of claim more often. If they don't, if they lose, it can stem this type of power grab. Well, Trump did not get away with this one. He lost this case by a wide margin with his own appointees that you see there, Gorsuch and Barrett, those are Trump-appointed justices, also ruling he exceeded his power. So, my first point to you on this, if you remember just one thing about this big Trump loss, it's this. You're looking at the coalition that may stop President Trump from abusing other emergency powers. Because while, of course, the U.S. can face real emergencies or wars, and they can empower a president to take certain actions, obviously, presidents can't just declare a permanent global emergency across their entire term. And on this issue, if you're interested in the facts, there's a 77 law that enables some extra powers in unusual and extraordinary threat situations. But that law doesn't even mention tariffs. And surely it doesn't apply to the 100-plus countries that Trump tried to tariff, claiming it was all under this one law. And if you're worried about government overreach, it doesn't really matter whether you agree with a given president or their party or even the goal. That's what government overreach looks like. That's why the court ruled against Trump today. And this point was on display with the initial skepticism we saw against the Trump DOJ when this case was first argued in the court.
I just don't understand this argument. It's not an article. It's a congressional power, not a presidential power to tax.
He didn't have that power to tax and tariff on his own. That's the law. You heard there Justice Sotomayor being nice about it. She said she didn't understand the Trump defense's argument because it made no sense. And now, from that set of questioning to today's loss for Trump, the Chief Justice rules that Trump asserts the independent power to impose tariffs on imports from any country, of any product, at any rate, for any amount of time. In other words, that type of claim is an absurdly impossible, kind of king-like power if you had it. And Roberts went on to explain, ruling against Trump today, no president has ever read that law I just showed you to, quote, confer such power. The other presidents who didn't see it that way were right, because no president has that kind of power. So this Supreme Court, which has clearly helped Trump in other ways, noted this is ultimately about those limits on power against any leader who would want to act like a king in this country. More about that than, say, economics data. The judges concluding that they ruled against Trump while noting they have no special competence in economics or foreign affairs. We claim only the limited role by the Constitution, they explained. Quote, we hold that the law does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. The law does not authorize those powers, so Trump doesn't have them. This matters, especially at a time when we have a president who lies about elections he lost and is sending the FBI in to seize ballots and is trying to indict his political opponents, journalists, and others. There are some people who like Trump so much they want to look the other way on that stuff. But I'm not here to talk to you about whether people like or dislike Trump. We still have a First Amendment in this country. You're free to make up your mind and express yourself. But that First Amendment that protects you is in a Constitution that also protects you by limiting him and anyone else who comes into power and tries to abuse government powers like a king. And that's why this one is a lot more intense than just a tariff debate. Trump tried an emergency excuse, and it bought him some time, but the court has now ruled it was false because there wasn't the kind of emergency that justified these powers, and it failed. Chief Justice Roberts, holding the line here as a longtime conservative appointed by Bush, joined by other Trump appointees, Barrett and Gorsuch, appointed by Trump. And that reinforces, even at a time where people are skeptical and there's so much partisanship, that on this issue the court had independence. It wasn't just a vote based on the party of the appointee or whether they had a history with Trump. Quite the contrary. Gorsuch may appreciate that Trump appointed him. They may like each other to some degree, but the law is the law. And this wasn't a close call by the time it reached the high court. They'd lost in the lower courts. Trump did acknowledge the loss today. He complained. He lashed out. He showed a kind of anger maybe because he knew he'd lost in public. At one point, complaining that he has other powers, like embargoes or war powers. So he thinks it's unfair that if he has those other big powers, why should this whole tariff power be limited? Well, let me tell you something, and this is an easy thing to understand. That complaint is not a legal or even a logical argument. The whole point of limited and separate powers in our system, the reason why we're not like Putin's Russia or Stalin's Russia or many other countries you could think of, is that we separate the powers. We have different powers in the government spread out. They're not all held by one person, let alone the king. And yet I'm going to let you hear, alongside the ruling, our president marveling at this system of checks and balances, almost as if he just learned about it today.
I cannot charge them anything. Think of that. How ridiculous is that? I'm allowed to embargo them. I'm allowed to tell them you can't do business in the United States anymore. We want you out of here. But if I want to charge them $10, I can't do that. It's incorrect. Their decision's incorrect.
He's upset. He disagrees with it. He thinks it's incorrect. And yet Trump's presentation references the limits on his power as he conceded the limits. He said he'd look for other ways to pursue tariffs, meaning other ways not barred by the limit on his power under this court and longstanding law.
They merely overruled a particular use of IEEPA tariffs. And essentially, it's the use to get a fee. It's ridiculous, but it's okay because we have other ways, numerous other ways. We have a totally firm decision now, and I don't think the court meant it because the court doesn't show great spirit toward our country, in my opinion.
He's entitled to his opinion. But the president was speaking as a man shown up here by a code he does not control. That's how power works. You can have some and still face other forces with their own power. That's true from the halls of government power in Washington out to the streets. Or as a classic Simple moment captured it in the hit show The Wire, which explores power and its limits, law and its inconsistencies, you'll see how when one man experiences the limits on his supposed authority, he wants it to be one way. But it's the other.
We want it to be one way. What? We want it to be one way.
Man, I don't
want it to be one way.
Man, stop! Stop saying that.
What is the other way?
Trump wanted it to be one way. But sometimes it's the other way. Today, it was the other way. The Supreme Court was able to say, And this is a crucial setback for any parts of Trump's second term that involve him wanting to be a king or seize unitary autocratic powers or claim that emergencies mean he gets to do what no one else is allowed to do. The learning curve may be tough, but it's the other way.
That's right, Ari. Another great line from The Wire. A man has got to have a code. He discovered that he's got a code, as Omar Little said, and that code is the Constitution. And over and over again, whatever you may think of the Supreme Court in the Alien Enemies Act case, in the City of Chicago National Guard case, and now in the tariffs case, the Supreme Court has said to him, you stick with your powers under Article 2. Do not encroach beyond the authority we've given you. Very, very important for maintaining democracy and combating Donald Trump's authoritarian bent.
Yeah. And when you look at sort of Donald Trump's claims today, I want to play another one of these contrasts of he clearly knew he lost. It was a different type of Trump, and maybe because the ruling came out and he insisted on live reacting within 2 hours or so, you could see that he just sort of didn't have a big lie yet to shroud it. I mean, I remember when we covered the 2020 loss, and it was they measured the longest time he'd gone without coming out to take questions as president. He went a couple weeks. Today he came right out and had anger. Take a look.
Mr. President, are you going to ask Congress to take additional action on tariffs now?
No, I don't need to. It's already been approved. I mean, I would ask Congress and probably get it.
And we showed earlier him sort of saying, I have these other powers, why don't I have this one? He could have asked Congress. On day one, there was a lot more political capital. How do you view this as someone who's worked in the White House, understands Washington, that the Supreme Court didn't say, you can't do this. It just said you can't do this without Congress. A more cooperative or collaborative leader might try.
Well, Ari, the problem is that Donald Trump doesn't actually want to do it the right way. He has other authorities that he could have used to do this, but they would require things like an investigation.
Every president has specific things they like to focus on. And I worked for two, I know this. Certain issues or beliefs or campaign slogans that they will go back to over and over again. But there's only one president that I know who has taken to such a liking to one particular word, a single noun from the English language, which he seems to prize above all else.
It's called tariffs. I said, my favorite word in the whole dictionary is tariff. I said, tariff is my favorite word in the whole dictionary. I said, my favorite word of every word is tariff. I've loved it for 40 years. My favorite word in the English dictionary is the word tariff. One of my favorite words is the word tariff. My favorite word is The word tariff, my favorite word, tariffs. I said tariff. My favorite word is tariff.
It's like he's grunting it out. It's his favorite word. That's clear. Nobody loves tariffs, it seems, more than Donald Trump loves tariffs. It's why, against all reason, Trump blanketed the world with steep tariffs, arbitrarily and chaotically driving up prices for millions of American consumers. And it's why today, when an aide walked into a meeting between Trump and a bunch of governors and handed him a note saying that the Supreme Court had struck down the vast majority of his tariffs, Trump went ballistic. I mean, immediately after that meeting, Trump held a hastily assembled press conference to mourn his precious tariffs. I mean, again, it's like the lighting in there is a funeral of sorts. I've never seen it lit like that. Over the course of 45 minutes, the American people got to watch him experience basically all 5 stages of grief live on television. I mean, there was stage 1, denial.
I have the right to do tariffs, and I've always had the right to do tariffs. The Supreme Court's decision today made a president's ability to both regulate trade and impose tariffs more powerful. I don't think the court meant that. I don't think the court meant it. I don't think they meant that. I'm sure they didn't.
They didn't mean it. Lots of denial. Now, of course, there was also stage 2, anger.
They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats.
There was stage 3, the form of bargaining.
I want to be very well behaved because I understand the court. I understand how they're very easily swayed. I want to be a good boy.
I want to be a good boy. Okay. There was stage 4, which is depression.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed.
And then eventually there was stage 5, some form of acceptance.
It's ridiculous, but it's okay because we have other ways, numerous other ways. Now I'm going to go in a different direction, probably the direction that I should have gone the first time. Now I'll go the way I could have gone originally.
And because it was Donald Trump, there was, of course, also a 6th stage of grief, saying whatever absolutely unhinged thing popped into his head at any given moment.
I can do anything I want to do to them, but I can't charge any money. So I'm allowed to destroy the country, but I can't charge them a little fee. And I don't like them. I think they're real slime balls. I read the paragraphs. I read very well. Great comprehension. For 30 years longer, they made chip, chip, chip. He said, sir, I want to kiss you so badly. This is a very powerful man. I don't want to be kissed by that man.
So that was all. That was on one press conference today, everyone. I mean, it's very clear Donald Trump is going through some things right now. It's the only way to explain it. He desperately, obviously, did not want to give up his tariffs, and there's a reason for that. For the past 40 years, long before he ever ran for president, Donald Trump has been obsessed with the idea of levying tariffs on other countries, talking about it in interview after interview. And it has never been based on any sort of economic theory. It's always been about one thing, and one thing only: power. Because Trump believes tariffs give him power over other countries. He doesn't care if that power comes at the expense of regular Americans who end up paying the tariffs. He's okay with that pain as long as it gives him power over other world leaders. As long as he gets to feel big and tough and powerful. Just listen to the way he talked about using tariffs against the nation of Switzerland.
You know, I had an incident with a very nice country, Switzerland. So I put on a 30% tariff, which is very low. Still, we were having a big deficit, but it was half the deficit. And I got an emergency call from, I believe, the Prime Minister of Switzerland, and she was very aggressive, but nice, but very aggressive. Sir, we are a small country. We can't do this. We can't do this. I couldn't get her off the phone. We are a small country. I said, you may be a small country, but we have a $42 billion deficit with you. No, we are a small country. Again and again and again. I couldn't get her off the phone. So it was at 30%. And I didn't really like the way she talked to us. And so instead of giving her a reduction, I raised it to 39%.
Okay. First off, when Trump says the prime minister of Switzerland, he's probably referring to the former president of Switzerland, Karen Keller-Sutter, who you can see right there. But the point here is that Trump claims he raised tariffs on Switzerland by 9% simply because he did not like the president's tone. It didn't matter that it would be regular Americans and Swiss citizens who would suffer as a result of those tariffs. All that mattered was Trump's ego. And even this conservative majority Supreme Court could not deny that there's no rationale or constitutional basis for letting a president create that kind of pain for his own personal vanity. I mean, Trump repeatedly claimed that his tariff policy was about helping American workers. At one point, he even promised to send every American a rebate check from all the money the U.S. was taking in from the tariffs. But this was never actually about helping regular people, to state the obvious, which is why, even after the Supreme Court declared these tariffs illegal and paved the way for repaying the people who were hurt by them, the Trump administration suddenly has no interest in helping regular people. I mean, here was Trump's very in touch Treasury Secretary on that particular subject just today.
Well, it's going to be a food fight going after $175 billion, isn't it? So
I got a feeling the American people won't see it.
I mean, he sounded almost gleeful there. Trump doesn't want to help people with his tariffs. Neither does anybody who works for him. He wants power. He wants to act like a king, which is why tonight he signed a new executive order that will impose new 10% tariffs on all countries under a different statute. Now, those new tariffs are also likely to be challenged, and the statute he's using only allows those tariffs to be in place for 150 days before Congress would have to make them permanent. And for those of you who don't have calculators in front of you right now, 150 days from now is August, which is right before the midterm elections. So there's that. But the point here is that he won't give up on this. He refuses to admit he does not have this power. Trump's tariff policy embodies everything that is wrong with this administration. The thirst for power, the willingness to ignore the Constitution, the chaotic implementation, and lack of regard for any consequences. It's the policy of a petty tyrant prone to tantrums. But today's ruling showed that the tyrant isn't as powerful as he thinks he is. And the real pushback against Trump's tariffs is just getting started. To truly understand why Donald Trump likes tariffs so much, I think you have to look at the Trump International real estate development currently underway in Vietnam. When Trump held what he called Liberation Day, as he called it, in April of last year, announcing his slew of proposed new tariffs, Vietnam was slated for some of the highest. Trump was threatening to put a 46% tariff on Vietnam. Now, at the same time, the Trump family real estate business was trying to get permission to develop a $1.5 billion new property in Vietnam. They basically wanted to build enough villas to house 35,000 residents, a 36-hole golf course, of course, theme parks, and a commercial district. Now, the approval process for something like that in Vietnam typically takes somewhere between 2 and 4 years. But somehow, last year, the Trump family managed to get the Vietnamese government to approve everything in just 3 months. Just 1 month after Trump threatened a 46% tariff on the country, Vietnam's central government short-circuited the process for the Trump family property. And legal experts described it this way to the Times, saying that to fast-track the Trump development, Vietnam ignored its own laws. Vietnamese officials have allowed the Trump project to break ground without completing at least a half dozen legally required steps, from securing all the land and financing to conducting environmental reviews. The government essentially forced the locals who lived or farmed on the land to sell, to clear the space for the Trump property. Now, in a letter obtained by the Times, Vietnamese officials explicitly stated that the project required special support from the top ranks of the Vietnamese government because it was receiving special attention from the Trump administration and President Trump personally. The Prime Minister of Vietnam himself even spoke at the groundbreaking. I mean, here he is with Eric Trump. Yeah, there he is. Now, at the time, the White House said that, quote, all of the president's trade discussions are totally unrelated to the Trump organization. Okay. And Vietnam's foreign ministry did not respond to questions about the project. But after all that, when it came time for Trump to actually implement the tariffs he threatened on his so-called Liberation Day, after the Vietnamese government had hustled and ignored their own laws to fast-track Trump's $1.5 billion project. What do you know? Trump dropped his tariff rate for Vietnam from 46% to just 20%. Gee, I wonder why. And if that example isn't clear enough for you, you could also look to Trump's tariffs on Switzerland, which I mentioned earlier. I mean, last August, Trump hit Switzerland with a 39% tariff, one of the highest tariffs in the world. Trump has since openly explained that his reasoning for that tariff was personal. He said that he made the tariff so high simply because the president of Switzerland, quote, rubbed him the wrong way. Now, in an effort to get that tariff rate cut down, Switzerland appeared to Trump personally. The Swiss sent a delegation of Swiss industry tycoons bearing gifts for Trump, a special Rolex desktop clock, there it is, and a personalized golden bar, valued at a little more than $130,000. Now, the White House says that Trump merely accepted the gifts on behalf of his presidential library, making them legal. But regardless of the legality, the charm offensive appears to have worked, because 10 days later, Trump cut Switzerland's tariffs from 39% to just 15%. Again, I wonder why. Last year, we also saw Trump try to use his tariffs to help his personal political buddies abroad. Back in 2022, the former president of Brazil and Trump's buddy, Bolsonaro, lost the Brazilian presidential election, but tried to stay in power anyway by mounting a military coup. Now, that coup, much like January 6th here, didn't work. But unlike January 6th here, where Trump managed to avoid all accountability, last year the government of Brazil was criminally prosecuting Bolsonaro for his coup attempt. Whether it was to help his buddy or to quash the precedent that governments could prosecute former leaders for coup attempts, Trump decided to intervene. He threatened a 50% tariff on Brazil, partly in retaliation for Bolsonaro's prosecution, demanding that Brazil's current president that he drop the charges. And guess what? Brazil didn't comply. Trump did hit the country with a 50% tariff, but Brazil prosecuted Bolsonaro anyway, sentencing him to 27 years in prison. And then, after all that chest pounding and all that bluster, Trump dropped the tariffs anyway. He chickened out. Now, what makes Trump using tariffs like this all the worse is that it is not just foreign countries that end up paying the price for all of Trump's wheeling and dealing. It's, of course, you. Last week, economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Columbia University determined that through November of last year, 90% of the economic burden of Trump's tariffs fell on U.S. companies and consumers. And days before that, a conservative-leaning think tank released their own research, showing that Trump's tariffs cost U.S. households an average of $1,000 last year. And that's a conservative estimate in more ways than one. Other estimates go as high as $2,400. So now that the Supreme Court has struck down most of Trump's tariffs as illegal, does anybody get a refund? Does anybody get any money back? And now that Trump has issued yet another round of tariffs, where do things go from here?
Tonight, as you know, the Supreme Court reminded the country that even the most powerful president in the world does not get to rewrite the Constitution to win an argument about economics. Tonight, Donald Trump lost, and he lost decisively on one of the defining policies of his political identity: tariffs. For years, Trump has described tariffs as economic magic, a way to punish foreign countries and rich Americans and fund the U.S. government all at once. He has insisted that other nations were paying us billions. Actually, he said billions and billions in his word, holding tariffs up as proof not just of policy success, but of personal strength. Today, the Supreme Court rejected the legal foundation behind key parts of that strategy. In plain English, a president cannot simply declare an economic emergency and impose sweeping tariffs on imports whenever he chooses. The court said there are constitutional limits, even for a president who's long argued that there should be none. Trump's response was immediate and swift, and as expected, defiant. Here's a portion of what he said today in the White House briefing room.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court. The Democrats on the court are thrilled, but they will automatically vote no. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests and a political movement that is far smaller than people would ever think.
Unpatriotic. Trump said he's got a backup plan, by the way. He claimed this ruling doesn't affect his tariffs and he can make even bigger tariffs, something we'll discuss over the course of the next hour. And that may be the most revealing part of the day, because this was never only about trade. It was about power. Whether a president can bend law to his will when Congress refuses to cooperate. So let's be clear about what these tariffs actually were. They were not tariffs that were debated and enacted by Congress, which is the way it's supposed to work. The Wall Street Journal explains it this way, quote, the case involved two categories of tariffs. Trump imposed one category on virtually every country in the world, ostensibly to repair trade deficits. He imposed the other set of tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, saying those countries are responsible for the flow of illegal fentanyl into the United States. Many were imposed using emergency or national security authorities, laws that were written for narrow cases and then expanded to cover everyday goods, steel, aluminum, consumer products, even automobiles. Economically, they functioned exactly like taxes. And despite years of political messaging to the contrary, economists across the ideological spectrum agree on one simple fact: Americans paid them. When goods entered United States ports, American importers paid tariffs to the U.S. government. Businesses then absorbed the cost through lower margins, or they passed on higher prices. Either way, the burden landed here at home, which brings us to a contradiction that today's ruling makes impossible to ignore. Donald Trump has claimed that tariffs generated enormous revenue for America, far beyond independent estimates, while at the same time insisting that there isn't enough money available to refund businesses if courts ruled the tariffs unlawful, as they did today. Both of those things cannot be true. Either tariffs produced massive windfalls, or the money was never what he claimed it was. The court's decision forces that reality into the open, and now comes the question that millions of Americans may reasonably ask tonight: who gets paid back? If you bought a car last year and you paid $1,000 more because tariffs had pushed the prices higher, do you get a refund? Probably not. Refunds, if ordered, go to the companies first that paid tariffs at the border, the importers, the manufacturers, the distributors. Whether consumers ever see that money depends on lawsuits, contracts, and competition. Donald Trump said today the litigation this ruling is likely to create could take years. Again, we'll have our experts react to that as well. Economics moves forward quickly. It almost never rewinds. And after years of disruption justified in the name of reshaping global trade, you may ask, what was the measurable result? The U.S. trade deficit, which Trump carries on all the time, improved last year by roughly $2 billion. $2 billion. It's a $30 trillion economy. $2 billion is not transformation. It is statistical noise achieved at enormous economic and political cost. And states absorbed much of that cost. Farmers faced retaliatory tariffs abroad. Manufacturers paid more for materials at home. Port economies endured instability as supply chains lurched from policy to policy. And now states and businesses confront uncertainty again, as courts now try to sort out refunds and companies adjust for the second time in just a few years. So, yes, this was a trade ruling, but it is actually a constitutional moment. Because tariffs are not just trade tools, they are taxes, and the Constitution is explicit about who controls taxation. Congress, not the president. And this case ultimately asked a question larger than tariffs themselves: whether political ambition can expand presidential authority beyond what the Constitution of the United States permits. Whether power can be claimed first and justified later. Today, the Supreme Court answered that question. Today, the Chief Justice of the United States said so plainly. Writing for the court, John Roberts reminded the country that, quote, the framers did not vest any part of the taxing power in the executive branch, end quote. That sentence reaches far beyond tariffs. It reaches back to the founding principle that concentrated power, especially economic power, is the very thing that the Constitution was designed to prevent. Donald Trump made tariffs a political symbol. He promised they would remake global trade. They would generate vast wealth. They would come at no cost to Americans. Today, the Supreme Court says the Constitution still sets the rules. The Chief Justice chose the Constitution over Donald Trump. And at a moment when many Americans wonder whether democratic institutions still have the strength to restrain power, the court delivered a reminder written into the country's original design. The guardrails are not gone. They held today. There is hope yet for the republic.
We are now 255 days away from the midterms, and the president's signature economic policy took a major hit today. The Supreme Court struck down most of the president's sweeping tariffs. In a 6-3 decision, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that Trump, quote, must identify clear congressional authorization to exercise it. But the president vowed to work around the ruling without Congress, calling the justices in the majority a disgrace to our nation and announcing a new 10% global tariff. Watch this.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court. The Democrats on the court are thrilled, but they will automatically vote no. They're an automatic no, just like in Congress. They're an automatic no. They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests and a political movement that is far smaller than people would ever think. But other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected. But I am allowed to cut off any and all trade or business with that same country. In other words, I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country-destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1. I have the right to do tariffs, and I've always had the right to do tariffs, and it's all been approved by Congress.
Congress has not, in fact, approved Trump's tariffs. We have so much to cover. Let's bring in our nightcap. Jim Acosta on his first visit to the nightcap, former chief White House correspondent, now host of the Jim Acosta Show on Substack, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. Reed Galen is back. He worked on a number of GOP campaigns. Now he is the president of JoinTheUnion.us and host of the Homefront podcast. Ron Insana is back, veteran financial journalist and publisher of The Message of the Markets on Substack. And Catherine Christian, former assistant district attorney at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She is now an MS Now legal analyst. Ron, we turn to you first for your reaction.
Not surprising. We certainly thought that the Supreme Court would turn down these tariffs as being illegal and not congressionally approved. What was surprising, I think, was the attack on the Supreme Court as being affected by foreign interests. That is a bridge too far, I think, for many to understand or tolerate. But the economic impact, if he did not immediately add the 10% tariffs onto what are now tariffs that are presumably going away, I think the markets and others would have responded differently. But this is a really tough one, Steph. There's so many moving parts to this. I don't understand the market response today with stocks being up against the backdrop where he's now openly at war with the Supreme Court and implementing further tariffs. And using justifications like he can do anything he wants, which is clearly not the case. That, to me, in past periods would have sparked a market sell-off and didn't. So, to be honest, I'm quite confused by market action today, not confused by what the Supreme Court did. And I am concerned that the imposition of new tariffs is going to keep inflation high, it's going to weaken the economy further, and not have any beneficial effect whatsoever.
But Ron, also weigh down businesses.
Yeah,
right.
Of course.
Yesterday, I met with a number of CEOs and we were talking tariffs, and they basically said whether we have tariffs or not isn't the issue. Is that every day it's a different picture. They're on Tuesday, they're off on Wednesday, right. They're tripled on Friday, and you cannot run a business big or small, or it occupies all of your intellectual capital and your time dealing with that. So the president immediately turning around and saying, "I'm going to put these tariffs on, whether you like it or not." Does that not paralyze our businesses?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, look, I've kind of taken a different tack from a phrase we use way too often, in my business, which is markets hate uncertainty. this is unpredictability, and it's an order of magnitude larger than uncertainty. And I think whether or not the stock market goes up or down, from a business perspective, small and large, they're having trouble trying to deal with this. Some of it's been passed on to the consumer. As we discussed last night, the New York Federal Reserve noted that 90% of the costs of these tariffs have been passed on to both American businesses and consumers. Foreign countries and companies are not paying those bills. We are. And so that means slightly higher inflation, potentially slightly slower growth, low fire economy, and we're kind of back where we started, given that he imposed new tariffs as soon as the Supreme Court overturned the old ones.
So the assumption, or the legal assumption, is now that these have been ruled unconstitutional, the government's going to have to give that money back, right? But Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked about it, and here's what he said.
Well, it's going to be a food fight going after $175 billion in it. So
I got a feeling the American people won't see it. Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, he's probably telling the truth. I mean, Senator Warren said, there's really no legal mechanism for these tariffs for people to get refunded.
What about the businesses?
The businesses. Now, it's interesting. The Court of International Trade, where the initial decision was, did set up a mechanism. I think it's going to be unwieldy and it's going to be bombarded, where you can apply, you have to fill out forms, show how you've been impacted, and seek redress. But that, you can just imagine how it's going to be so inundated and flooded with that. And then on top of that, you now have the president saying today, well, I'm going to still keep doing it anyway. I heard someone else today say it's sort of like whack-a-mole. It's like, okay, you don't like that? I'll do it this way. I'll do it this way. So he has clearly, the president, decided he doesn't care what the Supreme Court says. I mean, he's shown utter disrespect for them today and the things that he said about them.
But just because he disrespected them doesn't mean that the rule of law doesn't work. But if there isn't a mechanism for the money to come back, what does that tell the world? We don't have rules here? We don't have laws?
Well, there is a mechanism, but my point is, if the president keeps saying, okay, I'm going to do tariffs, 150 days are over, okay, I'll try another mechanism. I'll try another mechanism.
Yeah. I think the president missed these episodes of Schoolhouse Rock that explained how the Constitution worked. The train has gone off the tracks at Conjunction Junction, I think, here. Listen, to Ron's point about Trump going after the Supreme Court justices, isn't this another example of projection? Yeah. It's every accusation is a confession or projection. He's the one who is swayed by foreign interests, Vladimir Putin among them. But the rule of law is the rule of law, and he's going to have to deal with the consequences of this decision. My sense of it, Stephanie, is that he is going to continue to be unhinged about this, and he's going to try to challenge, the courts having any kind of sway over him. And to me, it's shaping up to be an even more, unhinged State of the Union speech on Tuesday night. We're either going to find the aliens, bomb Iran, or bomb the aliens. It's one of those three.
Or bomb the aliens in Iran.
It might be one of those, exactly.
How big of a political loss is this? Because it doesn't matter what the president says. People now understand that it costs Americans more to buy and build with tariffs.
These are Trump taxes. That's what they've always been. The Supreme Court said the Trump taxes are illegal. And what was the first thing he did? He said, don't worry about it. I'm going to make sure these taxes on you, the consumer, stay high. And Bessent said, what did he say? Oh, we're going to get rid of the tariffs. The American people aren't going to see any of that money, right? I mean, they are just writing the ads themselves. They should be up right now. They should, when this goes to commercial, the Democratic Party should be running ads as we go to break tonight about this, that this is nothing more than your taxes having been high, because here's the other part. He cut taxes for very wealthy people and filled the gap with tariffs, which is a tax on you. That's what he did. And this is absolutely a political goldmine if the Democrats know how to use it.
But, I mean, don't you think, and this is going to be a foreign concept to Donald Trump, but, I mean, the American people, particularly the farmers in the Midwest, are owed a big apology here. I mean, they've been put through the ringer again with this tariff policy. It happened in the first administration. It's happening again. And as for the markets, it seems to me, and I'm no business analyst or anything of the sort, but it seems to me this is baked in. down on Wall Street. This is not, Trump always chickens out. This is Trump always crashes out. And I think they've just made this decision down on Wall Street that, this guy's going to do his thing and, we're just going to keep whistling past the graveyard.
But the thing, Ron, is Wall Street forever was like, oh, don't listen to what he says, listen to what he does. He's doing it.
Yeah. And I'm at a loss to explain today's action, right, with the market. Dow was up 200.
That's why I like to ask you the question over and over.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but I do agree with Jim. To a certain extent, look, there are other factors, obviously, that influence stock prices, corporate earnings, and the level of interest rates. We had conflicting economic data come out this morning. GDP was weaker than we thought. Inflation was higher than we thought. Again, for a day like today, you would think the market would have sold off immediately after the president said that he was going to reinstitute these Section 122 tariffs at 10% across the board, all countries. And that didn't really make anybody blink. And so that part I don't understand. There's, going forward, I think he will have to deal with an economy that is, one, not growing 15%, as he said it was going to this year, that the tariffs are going to keep prices elevated. They're going to offset whatever larger tax refunds that people are getting this year. It's supposed to be $1,000 more this year. You're paying $1,000 more because of the tariffs. So it's a wash. And so I think from an economic perspective, he's backing himself into a corner that he ultimately by the midterms is not going to be able to get out of.
See, big investors I spoke to today, beyond it being a net positive that, hey, maybe businesses are going to get money back, they like the idea that despite the fact that this Supreme Court has been deferential to the president on a lot of things, they're actually standing up to him. What do you make of that part of it? And even Neil Gorsuch's specific opinion.
That's the reason I believe the president was so angry, because you had 6 that are supposed to be the Republican judges not going his way. And he was particularly angry at Gorsuch and Barrett. I believe he said that this ridiculous statement, they're an embarrassment to their families. He said that about those 2 justices. Gorsuch's opinion was very telling. He gave a history lesson. Basically, he was educating the public, and I think that was his intent, on, separation of powers. This is what Congress is for. This is the judicial branch. This is the president. We didn't want kings. That's why we had the Constitution the way it was, written out. He even, and I think, and I don't know him personally, but I think when he states that the process, the congressional process, the nation can tap the combined wisdom of the people's elected representatives, not just that of one faction or man. So he's saying, you may not like this decision, but there's a reason why we have a Congress, and it's because everyone picks these people, like it or not, you voted for them, and not just one person, a king, deciding this is what I'm going to do. I think that's what made, I doubt that the president read the decision, but I think that's what made him so angry, that you had Barrett and Gorsuch and Roberts saying, you don't have the authority to do this, Mr. President. And they were not his lapdogs. He referred to other justices as being lapdogs of, the liberals and foreign interests. But because these 6, and particularly Barrett and Gorsuch, were not lapdogs to the president, that's why you saw the anger today.
But maybe that's it. If the No Kings movement had a manifesto, who would have thunk it? Neil Gorsuch wrote it.
Yeah.